Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today we're doing something a little different. We're going to be talking about organizational culture. So my guest today is Dr. Urmila Edith Best. She's done a lot of work in this area. So Urmila, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So could you, first of all, explain the topic and why people might find it interesting? We can move on from there.
Okay. Well, there's a saying in architecture, form follows function. That the form something has relates to the function that it has. And the function something has relates to the form that it has. Think of the difference between, eating utensils, a spoon and a fork and a knife. They have their form according to their function. So the form that an organization has directly impacts the functions that it can do or do well. If it has a form related to a different function that you don't want it to have, the organization may not be able to do the function for which it's intended. And hardly anyone thinks about this point. So if you have an organization that's not achieving its stated goals, that's not achieving its aims, the kind of fixes that people try to do rarely involve the form of the organization. They just don't think about it. I mean, let's say that you're trying to eat something with a spoon that could be far better eaten with a fork, or something with a fork that could be far better eaten with a spoon. Suppose you're given a bowl of soup and you're trying to eat it with a fork. And instead of thinking that you might have the wrong form of a utensil, you think, well, let me get a different fork, or let me hold my fork in my other hand, or let me hold my fork in a different way. And you keep being frustrated that it's not working. But the problem is that you have the wrong form. And it's just not something that people think about a lot. Now, people do think about this quite a bit when it comes to government. We have several different forms of government in the world. And people definitely think about, well, if there's a problem in the running of a country, maybe we need a different form of government. Now, I'd say that's not so much the way people think in 2023, but it is the way people thought in the past. You can think about the Russian Revolution that experimented with a new form of government as communism. Or you can think of, how the French Revolution and the American Revolution tried a new form of government, thinking, well, the problems can be solved if we change the form of government. I don't think such is thought about a whole lot at all in regard to religious organizations, but it's just as relevant.
Cool, thanks for that. And then we can have a little bit about your academic background, how you came to know the subject well.
Well, my master's degree is in school administration. Just like people get an MBA in business, I have an MSA, so I have a master's of school administration. And my PhD is in education, but specifically in educational leadership. So a lot of what I studied at both the graduate levels, both the master's and the doctoral level, was in the form of nonprofit educational organizations and the culture of such organizations, which are markedly different in many significant ways than the form of, say, for-profit organizations or governments, businesses, things like that.
Right. So I've heard you give seminars on the subject, and you explain how there's different kinds of organizations and they all need different forms of how they're run. And you explained how often when people are looking to study for a religion, how can we get ideas how to run this organization better, they'll study business. And there's issues that come from trying to transpose a model that works in a business with people getting paid onto an organization full of volunteers that's not for profit. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, just think about this logically. Let's say you have an organization, a business that operates just in the United States or just in the United States and Canada. So it's working with people of a somewhat similar culture. I mean, there's a lot of subcultures in America, but a somewhat similar culture. And then everyone's getting paid, and everyone's getting paid a salary at market prices. And let's say they're selling tangible goods. Let's say they're selling office chairs or something like that. So they're selling a physical product. Everyone's getting paid, and everyone's from the same country and more or less the same culture. Now you take a religious organization that's multinational, right? That has branches in every culture, practically every country of the world. And different cultures are markedly different from each other. Even there's a big difference between French culture and German culture, for example, or French culture and British culture. So you're dealing all of a sudden with many, many different cultures. And now your workers are either completely unpaid or they're compensated at a very low level. They're compensated below market rates. You're giving them some kind of stipend. So they still have the mood of a volunteer. And the so-called product that they're selling is love of God. They're selling spirituality. They're selling salvation, in effect. That's their product, not office chairs. So you can see that the culture, the function, everything is completely different. And what would work well in one environment might be an absolute failure in another. Now, obviously, there's going to be some overlap. You're still going to add the numbers in the accounting department the same way. You're still going to repair the plumbing in the same way. But how you're going to structure your organization and the kind of relationships you have, the ways of settling disputes, the ways of making decisions will be markedly, or should be markedly different, because your environment, your people, your function is quite different.
And what sort of issues would you get from mixing up those two styles?
All right, well, let's just think about a simple difference we all experience, and that is between a paid culture and, say, a family culture. So let's say you go to your grandma's house, for a family dinner, and the whole family's there, all the aunts and uncles and cousins and everything. And your grandmother cooks a big meal. And afterwards you give her, $300 and say, thank you for the meal. She would be grievously offended, right? It's not the way family culture works. In a family culture, everyone is expected to give a lot, and everyone also expects to get a lot. Like in a family, you feel if there was some serious problem, that your family's going to be there for you. You have a chronic illness or something, people will take you in, they'll take care of you without charge. And you're going to do that for them. And there's this understanding that everybody's going to be there for each other. There's an understanding that if there's some emergency, people are going to go above and beyond. In a paid environment, it's not like that at all. Things are very clearly delineated. You're doing XYZ job for XYZ number of hours for XYZ amount of pay, and that's it. If I do my job in that amount of time, I expect to get paid that amount of money. The value of my work is very clearly given by how much money I'm paid. And if my boss says, I want you to stay overtime, I can say no. At least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work, that I can say, I work this hour to this hour and now I'm done. Now I'm going home and I have my other life. And what everyone's giving each other is very, very clear. At least that's the way it's supposed to work in a paid environment, right? I mean, obviously some places are toxic, but in a proper work environment, there's usually a contract. And what is the company going to do for me? What am I going to do for the company? What compensation am I getting? What the expectations are crystal clear. And we show value to a large extent in money. Now, we may show we value people in other ways. Maybe we hold a birthday party for them. Maybe we give them nice equipment to work on. We treat them with respect and so forth. We may have other ways of showing we value them, but the primary way we're showing we value them is by paying them. In a family situation, it's completely different. So a volunteer organization is much more like a family, where the organization taking care of you, the members taking care of each other, the members giving to the organization, it's all kind of fuzzy. And there's some concept that I'm giving a lot and I'm getting a lot. Is that clear? Yeah. So when you impose the monetary model, like imagine a family where you impose the monetary model on a family, it would completely change the dynamics. Now, let's say you impose a monetary value on a family, but you don't have the money. So you take the model of a business environment, you put it on a family, but you're not actually paying anybody. That means you take away all the ways of valuing. In a family, we show each other, we value each other without having this clearly delineated time and money exchange. We have other ways of communicating value. So you're going to eliminate that. You're going to put a corporate model on it that has monetary ways of showing value, but you're going to remove the money. What's going to happen?
People will stop doing the work.
Yes. And how will people feel?
Upset.
Definitely. Definitely. You've eliminated any way of people having clear expectations. So everyone's going to walk in with their own expectations, which are not going to be commensurate with the system that's going on.
I think the analogy for paying for a grandma's meal when you visit her house is quite jarring. If people could understand how that it was a similar situation with a religious organization, it might change the culture a little, eh?
Yes. Or if conversely, you went to a restaurant and you, instead of paying, you just said, hey, that was a great meal. Thank you very much.
Oh, that makes me think of work, because I run my own business now, and sometimes you kind of build a relationship with like a mechanic or something, and then it's like, if you're giving me cheap work on my car, then am I supposed to give you cheap electrical work too? Like, I'd rather we just charge each other market rates and support each other's businesses by being loyal and supplying work to each other and doing like high quality work. But like this whole like dropping the rates thing, that gets awkward, because it's like, well, how much do I drop my rate by, and am I losing more than you're losing? And
yes. Exactly. So you're explaining when the line between like a family situation and a business situation becomes fuzzy and everybody becomes dissatisfied. It needs to be clearly one or the other. But a religious organization, if it's run like a business, the whole mood changes. Now, I'm not saying that religion should never pay anybody. Obviously, we need to pay people. Any religious organization still needs to pay people. But you don't want the culture to be that of a for-profit business. And think of also the difference between a for-profit business and a nonprofit. Religions are supposed to be nonprofit, that there's nobody that's particularly getting rich from the religion. And I don't think I have to really get into the possible harms of that mixture.
well,
We all know what happens when some religious leader is personally raking it in because people are feeling, I'm giving to God and I'm giving to God's work. And the religious leaders, they may take what they need to live, but they're supposed to live more simply than the average person. They're supposed to be toning down their needs, even if they have a family. And they're supposed to be giving the majority of their time and money to God's work. right? And so if that's not happening, we don't expect that in a business. Like, people may justifiably complain about how much money Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have. They definitely have more money than human beings should have. Uh, but nobody's faulting them for making a profit from their business. You follow? No one's going to say, well, Bezos and Musk, they shouldn't be making any money. They should be running their, Amazon and Tesla should be run as charities. But if you have something that's a religion, again, if people are giving money to their temple, to their synagogue, to their church, to their mosque, the concept is that the people that religious organization are maintaining, whatever, the priests, the ministers, whatever, the nuns, the monks, that they're not profit minded. They're not thinking, I want to use God's work to make a profit. So if you keep that model, but you impose the culture and the form of a for-profit business on that religion, it's going to be difficult for the leaders to keep that mentality, and you will attract leaders who have a for-profit mentality.
It's making me think of the PhD system universities have, because there's some injunction. Devotees are, if you do devotional service and you're getting paid for it, then it's not devotional service. So devotees have this idea you shouldn't be paid for anything. But then there's the PhD system where you get a stipend, which is very little money, but it means you're actually able to do the service. So if somebody wants to continue studying and the university values that, then there can be arrangement where the person's not raking it in, but they can eat and have a place to live while they're and carry on their study.
Yes, that doesn't always work well with the PhD system, but the concept is there. It's exactly the same thing. That people who are living full lives as, priests, ministers, etc., that they should be given enough money to live, and they should be given enough money to live without anxiety. It's not that they should be constantly in anxiety about money, especially if they have a family, but it shouldn't be a for-profit mentality. And this concept that if I get paid for it, it's not service, is ridiculous. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that sacrifice yajna without remuneration to the priest is in the mode of ignorance. So if you have, whether the priests are doing the Sankirtan yajna or they're doing a Pujari yajna or whatever, they're supposed to be given remuneration. They're supposed to be taken care of. We're not supposed to take anything from anybody without giving them something in return. That's extremely sinful. That's called stealing. So the people who are dedicating their life to God, they're supposed to be maintained by the congregants, particularly, and by society in general. But it's not that they should be getting rich off of God's service. If they want to get rich, they're in the wrong occupation. Then they should be business people. It's like if you have aspirations to be rich, then you don't become a minister, right? It's incongruous. I mean, we have Christian organizations in America that have this prosperity gospel that say you can tell how much Jesus loves you by how big your bank account is, and that the ministers in the prosperity mentality, they advertise their bank accounts as proof of their holiness. So that's disgusting, actually. Now, religious people don't mind having huge amounts of money to do God's work. If you gave me $10 billion, it's not that I would say, oh, no, I only want $100, but I'm not going to use that to build a super yacht. You follow? So I can relax on my super yacht.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that to do God's work in the world. So that's the concept of people who are being maintained by a religious organization. Now, it's going to be much easier for that to function if the form of the religious organization is commensurate with that kind of behavior. If you take the form of a for-profit organization and force it on religion, then the tendency is going to be for people to be for-profit money. Now, if then in addition you tell people that no one should even be maintained, I mean, then you're really skewed.
Right.
So you're taking a for-profit form, you're putting that on a religion, and then you're telling the people in the religion, if you even get maintained so that you can live, then you're not actually religious. You're going to that extreme that you're not even going to compensate people so that they can live. But you have the form of a for-profit business.
There's this tendency
What a mess.
humans have to look over at another system and say, oh, that system looks good. I'm going to take the things from that system that I like, keep the things from the system that we've currently got over here, and mix those two together. And it's like trying to take the chicken that lays the golden eggs and cut it in half. Because like they did that in New Zealand with the tenancy laws, because they looked at Germany. And in Germany, tenants have all sorts of rights. You sign a 10-year lease, but you can't get kicked out easily. All sorts of rights. If you're renting in Germany, you're not just going to get kicked out at a moment's notice because the tenant decide that they want to move a family member in or something. But there's negatives for the tenant too. So the New Zealand, they wanted to be like, oh, we've got to give tenants rights. So they took those laws that are in favor of the tenant and tried to bring something like that over here. But then they left out the bits that are good for the landlord, like when you move out, you fully renovate the place and you leave it in a pristine condition. And when you move in, you might fully renovate it too. And like you pay for all the maintenance yourself. You don't call the landlord because your dishwasher broke or because the plumbing's leaking. You have full responsibility. And if you don't bring the things together that make the system work, then you just create all this mess where like I was talking to one landlord who couldn't kick out some drug dealers because tenancy rights. It's like criminal activity going on his property. You can't get rid of them.
Yes, well, you're making me think about the general problem of picking something from another culture, or another organization, just cherry picking without understanding the whole context in which that operates.
Yeah, I think.
And it's a general problem. I mean, look, this happens also. We in the Hare Krishna movement, our movement started 500 years ago with Lord Chaitanya in India. And so a lot of our members are people who were born in India or the children of people who were born in India. And like every other country, India has its own culture, and actually different parts of India have different cultures as well. India is a big country with many subcultures, and those subcultures can be quite different from each other. And we see that people can sometimes try to take a cultural part of India and try to stick it in Germany, where the whole context in which that culture operates isn't there. And the result is havoc.
Yeah.
We've seen this in our Hare Krishna movement, that people make the assumption that because our movement started in India, and because our scriptures describe a culture that has some overlap with what happens in a lot of India in 2023, that therefore we can just take something from what happens in India in 2023 and put that, into Portugal, and it's going to work. But the whole support system is missing, and the whole context and the meaning of what's there is missing. And so we just end up with the problem.
I think a good analogy for that dynamic is gut flora. So someone in a particular country will have a particular gut flora, and then they go visit India and there's different bacteria around and it totally throws their gut flora out of whack. And so you have different gut flora where they're all, it's sort of some pathogens there, but you got the good ones and there's a balance and it's all working. And if you get your gut flora wiped out, then it takes a lot to build it back up again. So if you have a culture that is a society that doesn't have any culture, that's just sitting prey for all sorts of bad things to come and happen. You need to have some kind of culture. But if you want to change from one culture to another, there's like a whole balance going on. You can't just kill everything and then introduce the new stuff. You get really sick. You need to either like gradually over years and years introduce the good stuff and build up a new balance that's different. So it's like you can go go back to the actual thing. Like you could go and move to India and live in Maharashtra where there's this really traditional culture with traditional values, and you could fully adopt it into your life. But then you can't just move people from India one by one and move them all over the place in the West. You could move like a whole culture of them into one little sub area, and they could build that up, and maybe people could join one by one. But it's a much trickier thing than to just say, oh, this is a good idea, let's all start following it tomorrow.
Yes, exactly. And I've seen Hare Krishna devotees just take, something Srila Prabhupada said about Indian culture and try to just take that one thing and institute it without the support and the milieu around it, and without understanding. I can give you an example. So Prabhupada made a statement. He said that a married woman doesn't talk to any man except for her husband. Now, first of all, Srila Prabhupada definitely did not mean that as an absolute thing. A married woman is definitely going to talk to her sons, even if they're adult sons, and her adult grandsons. She's probably going to talk to her father. She's going to talk to her brothers. She's going to talk to her uncles. In other words, at the very least, she's going to talk to other male family members. She's not going to talk only to her husband. And when we look at the Bhagavatam and the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we see that women do talk to men even outside the family in these old traditional cultures of hundreds and thousands of years ago. The women were sometimes talking in very public arenas. So what did Srila Prabhupada mean by that the married women don't talk to any men besides their husband? He must have meant a very particular type of talking. He must have meant a particular type of discussion, not any words that come out of your mouth ever. Married women went to shops and talked to the shopkeepers. I mean, it just, So anyway, I was in this one temple where the temple president decided to institute this. So the unmarried women were allowed to talk to any of the men, but the married women were not. And if we married women wanted to communicate with a man, we would have to write it down and give him a note, which I think is a lot more intimate than just speaking. And I remember there were many crazy things that happened because of this policy. But one of the most dangerous was there was a married woman who was cooking in the kitchen. And the kitchen windows overlooked the parking lot. And there was one of the single men, one of the monks, was out in the parking lot working on one of the cars, and one of the cars caught on fire. So there was a hose that went from outside the parking lot into the building, but the spigot for the hose was in the kitchen. So he was asking the woman in the kitchen to turn on the spigot for the hose so he could put out the fire. But because she had this mood that she wasn't allowed to talk to any men other than her husband, she refused to even look at him or acknowledge him, and she wouldn't turn on the hose. So this was the absurdity of,
oh God.
There was a lot more. I could bore you for hours with all the stories of this, but this was the absurdity of someone hearing something from Srila Prabhupada, not understanding at all what Srila Prabhupada meant, because he was divorcing it from the cultural context and then trying to just plop it into another situation without any understanding. And we obviously do take a lot of wonderful cultural things from India, and I see Indians take a lot of wonderful cultural things from America, but it should be done, again, carefully and understanding what the implications are in a general way.
Yeah, that's a pretty crazy example with the fire. Geez.
I was right there. I saw it. I mean, this isn't a story. It was something I personally experienced.
I guess that gets into hermeneutics too, because like the whole thing with hermeneutics is understanding what is meant by particular statements requires background knowledge that you may or may not already have.
Correct.
And talking about that background knowledge of like, well, what is it that is assumed that we already understand in those statements, and do we already know those things, or do we need to do more study?
Mm-hmm.
Moving on. So I think now might be a good time to talk about the managerial genius of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Srila Prabhupada. Could you say a bit about that?
Well, both Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada were adamant that a religious organization should neither be bureaucratic nor centralized. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur used words like mechanistic and living. A mechanistic system is a bureaucracy, and a non-bureaucracy is called organic or living. So both of them talked about having religious organizations that were non-bureaucratic, decentralized, living, organic, not mechanical. And each of them said very strongly, very unambiguously, very explicitly, without any room for various interpretations and understandings, that if you have a religious organization and make it bureaucratic, mechanical, centralized, that it will no longer be the vehicle for the living spiritual tradition. They were emphatic about it. And their very strong views on this, I have seen, are mostly ignored. People have, you were talking about assumptions, people have an assumption that organization and bureaucracy are synonyms. They are not. So when people say you should not have a bureaucratic organization, they think they're being asked to do something impossible. And I mean, I've heard many leaders in the Hare Krishna movement say this to me, well, organizations have to be bureaucratic. So they take these instructions from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and from Srila Prabhupada and just dismiss them. They just say, well, this is an impossible instruction, just dismiss it. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we at least consider, and I'm being a little facetious here, at least we consider the possibility that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada were saying something that was possible, that they were not asking us something impossible, and that therefore we might try to find out how you could have an organization that is organic and decentralized. Now, when Srila Prabhupada was with us on the planet and running ISKCON himself, he ran it in a very organic, decentralized fashion. And anytime that his disciples who were managing things tried to make things bureaucratic and centralized, he would do his best to stop it. And those were the sort of things that he would get very strong about. I mean, there were certain topics, certain things that Prabhupada would really get very strong about, that he felt very strongly about it and really emphasized to his followers. You know, not saying the guru is God. When he had disciples who said he was God, he threw them out of the movement temporarily. You know, that was something that he felt very strongly about. Taking proper care of the deities. Following no meat, fish, or eggs, no intoxication, no illicit sex, no gambling. And another thing he felt very strongly about was avoiding bureaucracy and centralization. And he would take extreme steps with his managers, very strong steps. I mean, just, he didn't tolerate it. But the tendency is there. The tendency is there. The reason why there's a tendency towards bureaucracy is that bureaucracy basically means, among other things, that you have standard responses to certain situations. You have like a set response. Think of it like a habit. You know, like each of us as individuals, we have certain habits of how we respond to certain situations. You know, which sock we put on first, which shoe we put on first, how we brush our teeth. We do it in a certain way. On any situation that we have encountered over and over again in time, we tend to get a set response to it. On any situation we have encountered over and over again in space, we tend to have a set response. So an organization is the same. if an organization exists for a long enough time, then the people in that organization will tend to encounter the similar situation over and over again in time. And if an organization gets big enough, it tends to encounter similar situations over and over again in space. And so, for efficiency's sake, the organization may develop systems, a set response to dealing with that situation that it's likely to encounter over and over and over again. And as it encounters more and more varieties of situations, an organization tends to get a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger rule book as to how to respond to those situations. So it becomes to the thing of, okay, this is happening. Let's look up on the book, page 235, paragraph 2, and that's how we respond. Now, all living organisms have to do this to some extent. Like we don't think about which part of our teeth to brush first. We probably brush our teeth, the different surfaces in the same order. And that's useful. However, if I'm dealing with another person, if I'm dealing with another living being, I don't want to have mechanized responses. What I want to have is I want to have responses that are based on certain principles or certain values, but that I can adjust according to my dealings with that individual at that time and place. Are you with me? You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. Comparing it to dealing with people,
All right.
how you brush your teeth versus how
if you're a machine, how you deal with another person. So like if you're a computer is going to respond. Of course, now we're getting so much AI, but a computer is going to respond pretty much the same way. If I hit the S key, it's always going to type an S. It's going to have the computer is not distinguishing whether it's dealing with another machine or it's dealing with a living being. My computer deals with the world as if the world was also a machine. But I, as a living being, shouldn't be doing that. And an organization that's organic, that's living, also shouldn't be doing that. Therefore, an organization that's not bureaucratic, instead of having a whole list of rules and procedures, is going to have mostly principles that can then be applied differently according to the different living beings with which the organization is dealing. So this was the idea. In Prabhupada, I talked about family and corporate, and Srila Prabhupada said that ISKCON should be like a family based on love and trust. He was looking for a family culture, not a business culture. So a living culture as if the organization is a living being, and then a culture as if it was a family rather than as if it was a business. So not a machine and not a business. And this was their absolute genius. I mean, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati developed an organization that existed throughout the states of India, which, as I said, have quite different subcultures. And then A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada established an organization that existed literally internationally, with all different countries and all different cultures. But in order to do that, you had this sort of organization. Now, over time, as we said, organizations tend to become bureaucratic. Therefore, there needs to be corrective measures taken in the organization quite frequently. It's not like you just set it up in the right way and then it's set up. It's not like you clean your room once. I mean, that would be nice, right?
Yep. Yeah, I've noticed that
wash your clothes once.
With other things that have bothered me about being in a religious organization. Eventually, you want to blame someone, and then you look around and study. Eventually, I'm like, actually, I think it just seems to be something that crops up, and you have to actively suppress it. Like we own a lifestyle block, and the maintenance here is insane. You can't just get it looking all pretty and pull all the weeds out and then forget about it. You're constantly having to stay on top of it, and then every season, there's things that need to be done.
Exactly. Yeah, I manage a little flower garden, and I'm every day I'm looking for weeds to pull. Every day. Somebody goes by and looks at it and goes, "Wow, it's beautiful." And I'm thinking, yeah, it's because we're pulling the weeds every day.
to carry on with this analogy, I've heard stories of a devotee being sent out to do some weeding and they pulled out the wrong plants. So I guess going with the weeding analogy here, we may have some people misunderstanding and pulling out the plants instead of the weeds, but the problem you just discussed is more there's a really bad weed that nobody even realizes needs to be pulled out, and in fact they think it's necessary and they're probably even cultivating it.
Correct.
This point about bureaucracy and centralization. So I've studied economics a fair bit, just because I find it interesting and better ways to structure society and so on. And one idea that comes up in there a lot is centralization versus decentralization in terms of like government price controls and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to letting free market set prices. So Thomas Sowell has this quote from his book Basic Economics, which explains why it is important to have local decision making rather than some central hub where the decisions are made. And he's got a few quotes on that, but this one in particular I want to pull up. So, knowledge is one of the most scarce of all resources, and a pricing system economizes on its use by forcing those with the most knowledge of their particular situation to make bids for goods and resources based on that knowledge rather than on their ability to influence other people in planning commissions, legislators, or royal palaces. However much articulation may be valued by intellectuals, it is not nearly as efficient a way of conveying accurate information as confronting people with a need to put your money where your mouth is. So how this applies to management of a religious organization is you have, a preaching project or, a little temple, and the local manager is going to know what's going to fire people up, what the community needs, what's working, what's not working. And if you place the decision making there, then things can happen successfully.
Absolutely. And that was the way Srila Prabhupada wanted it. Prabhupada primarily wanted the GBC to make sure that each temple was following the basic program, 4 regular principles, 16 rounds, worshiping the deities, but to leave the main decisions up to local management. And your point is extremely important. I mean, I was recently visiting a temple in Seattle, Washington State in America. And this part of the United States is one of the most politically liberal sections of the country. For example, the crosswalks are painted in rainbow colors. I mean, it's a super, super liberal area. There's kind of like a corridor along the Pacific Ocean from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington State, and probably going up to a little bit in Canada. That's just, super, super politically liberal. In contrast to, say, Texas, which is super politically conservative. So in that temple, the leaders are people who were born in India and, who came to America probably in their 20s or 30s. So when you go into the temple room, there were big banners about what's wrong with meat eating, intoxication, illicit sex, and gambling. The banners would have been very attractive to evangelical Christians in Texas. An evangelical Christian in Texas would have looked at those banners and said, yes, this is the kind of organization that I want to be part of. But the sort of people who live in the Seattle area are not the kind of people who would be enthused by something like that. They might be enthused by something like that a month or 2 or 3 after they got involved with the organization, but not on the first day. Conversely, if you went to, the evangelical Christians in Texas and said that God is a cowherd boy who sings and dances and plays a flute, they wouldn't have any interest. But probably if that's the way you presented Krishna consciousness in the Seattle area, the local people would be extremely receptive. And so you really want to have local people who understand the local microclimate and understand what's going to be suitable for the people in that area, what's going to fit with their lifestyle, even such a simple thing as having a Sunday feast program that goes on until 8:30 at night in an area where most of the congregation is living.
Yeah, sorry, I did a job yesterday and I forgot to switch the power back on after I did it. So they just called me to so I could walk them through how to turn it back on.
Okay.
Cool. Do you want to carry on where you were?
I don't remember what we were talking about.
Okay, sorry. Well, yeah, we were talking about having knowledge be made by decisions being made locally by people who care. Like,
right. I mean, I was just thinking about the Sunday feast. You have some temples where most people have young children and they live an hour away, and you've got a Sunday feast program that goes till 8:30 at night. So people don't want to come because their children have to go to school in the morning and they can't get to bed on time. But someone's saying, well, this is, the way Prabhupada had it in New York City in 1966. So, we have to keep doing it that way. But that way may have been appropriate if you're having a bunch of single people who live a block away.
Yeah, the temple here, one of the managers had children, well, a couple of years ago now. I guess his oldest is 6.5. But yeah, after one of the managers had kids, they changed when they serve meals, and some of the programs finishes earlier. Sometimes they serve the meal first. It's like, yeah. It's not like the needs of the congregation change just because one of the managers is in a different situation.
That's sadly funny.
Yeah. There was another Thomas Sowell quote that talks about how, I haven't got it pulled up, but it's something like, it's the height of stupidity to place the decision-making power in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong.
That's very interesting. I'm in a personal situation where the person who is making decisions, I'm going to be the one who pays the price for their decisions, but I don't have the power to make decisions. I'm in that situation right now. It's quite frustrating.
Right.
And I'm saying to the person, I need you to do this and this and this. And the person is like, yeah, whatever. And I'm thinking, yeah, because you're not paying the price at all. The person paying the price is going to be me.
Wow. That's why the what we hear about the Vedic system of how kings were responsible was so interesting. Like, people would, if something wasn't going right in the kingdom, people would go personally and complain to the king. And there's a lot of responsibility there. Also, there's a description of how the king gets 1/6 of the karma of the whole kingdom. So if, you can imagine, you wouldn't want to be president of America where so many sinful things are happening unless you could really improve the moral fabric of the country.
Well, such is the case with war. Like, where if the leader of the country has to lead the battle on the ground, it's not just fought with drones or something. The leader of the country. So how often are they going to declare a war? Like, how often are you going to declare a war when you've got to be at the head of the army on the ground? I mean, you're going to make sure that you really know what you're fighting for and what you're fighting about if you're going to be the one who's on the ground in the front.
Yeah, it makes me think of that song, Masters of War by Bob Dylan. Do you know the one?
I don't remember that one.
Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind death. I just want you to know I can see through your mask. You that never done nothing but build to destroy. You play with my world like it's your little toy. Yeah, it's just basically like, it's a really powerful emotional song about how, like, the people just choose. It was about, I think, the Vietnam War. The people choosing to have the war happen are just hiding behind desks while all these young people are going out and dying. And it's written from the perspective of one of these young people that has to go out and die in this war, being furious with the people who made these decisions to have the war happen.
Right. I mean, the way I usually put it is that authority and responsibility should go together. But I like, how did you put it before? What was the word you used?
It's really, the height of stupidity to place the decision-making power in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong.
Maybe you could actually send that to me in writing in a message.
Yeah, sure. I'll pull up the quote. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, like, there's a few factors.
It's the concept of authority. Now, this is also what you just hit on right now is another aspect of bureaucracy. So I talked about bureaucracy as where your rule book keeps getting bigger and bigger, and where you tend to have a very mechanical response to situations. A situation happens, you look up. When that situation happens, what do we do when you do that in a very mechanical way? That's one aspect of bureaucracy. Another aspect of bureaucracy is that, you don't really take responsibility. There was one time devotees were talking with Srila Prabhupada, and they were using the word they. You'll hear this a lot among devotees, they, the leaders, did this. And Prabhupada said, do not say they. He says, that is bureaucracy. You are all they. So this idea of joint decision-making and decision-making by the people who are actually taking the responsibility and will actually have the consequences. That means that the people taking the authority have to be willing to have the consequences, and the people who have the consequences have the ability to have the authority. It goes both ways. If you're accepting the consequences, you have the authority to make decisions. If you have the authority to make decisions, you also have to be part of the consequences. And that is an organic system that is the opposite to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy it's his decision. It's their decision over there. It's not like it's their fault.
Oh, that makes me think of health and safety. Like there's maybe 8 years ago in New Zealand, they brought in all these strict health and safety standards, and basically what it is a bunch of paperwork that we have to push around in order to make it the case that when something does happen, we know who to blame, or everybody can say you can't blame me because all the paperwork was done and I made sure the paperwork was done. But nobody's made safer by bits of paper being filled out. People are made safer by changes in culture, education, training, money being spent when necessary in order to provide safety equipment.
Exactly.
On the point of not having an automatic procedure you follow for decision making, I find that like I do a lot of maintenance electrical work, so you get there and something's not working and you have to figure out how to fix it. And if you just like, oh, last time I came to fix one of these, this is what the problem was, and here's how I diagnosed the problem, and here's how I fixed it, and you could get there and there's a particular thing you do, it gives you the result you're expecting, but it turns out that was just a coincidence. And it just seemed, because it's an intermittent fault, and the fault just happened. I tried 4 things. The 4th thing, after I tried that, the fault went away. But it was just an intermittent fault, and it's coming and going, and you can just be barking around up the wrong tree for hours. Because I always try to get in this headspace of like, sometimes I'm there with someone else, and it's like, well, it could be this, and they're like, oh no, it wouldn't be that, because nobody would wire it that way. It's like, but they might have wired it that way. You never know how stupid the last guy was. Like, let's check.
Right. So it's interesting that you're saying this, because you're talking about a physical object.
Yeah.
And you're saying that even with physical objects and physical systems, you can't necessarily have exactly the same response to what appears to be the same situation. That even when it comes to physical objects and physical systems, mechanical systems, non-living systems, that you need to have some flexibility and you need to have some out-of-the-box thinking. What to speak of when you're dealing with living systems, and spirituality is the most living of the living systems. You're dealing with the soul. It's interesting if you look at science. Like, science is most predictable, but not entirely so, when it comes to things like math and physics. Even math and physics isn't nearly as predictable and as set in stone and as mechanical as people think. Now, what to speak of when you get to chemistry? And what to speak of when you get to biology, when you get to medicine? I think, any of us who've lived long enough and know enough people know that diagnosis of disease is not easy. That a lot of treatment is based just on diagnosis, and some people go years without getting a proper diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
And you can have the same grouping of symptoms that are coming from very different diseases and very different causes. Now, that's just the physical body. Then let's go to the mind. How complex is the mind? How difficult is it to say this particular mental symptom is always going to have the same cause and the same treatment in 10 different people? Then look at the soul. So a spiritual organization, a religious organization that's dealing on the level of the soul has to work just on basic principles and not on some mechanistic formula. If you can't use an absolute mechanistic formula for fixing electrical wiring, how in the world are you going to use a mechanistic formula for dealing with the soul?
Yeah, exactly. There's a few more points I wanted to make about where the decision-making power sits being important, because the way I think of it is there's two factors that are at play here. There's the moral fortitude of the person, and there's the amount of knowledge they have. And so we all have a limited amount of moral fortitude. So, if I'm making decisions that affect people that are very distant from me, there's less sort of emotional impact on me for making decisions that harm me. And if I'm making that decision for a billion people and it's going to cost a billion people $1, but it'll put $1 billion in my pocket, it's like, well, that's a lot of money for me and not a lot of cost for them. So the way I think about that in terms of business is having these big mega corporations that are making decisions about having sweatshop factories or Walmart paying their employees less. I don't think that would happen if you had the little local dairy and it's like my employees are my neighbor's kids. I watch them grow up. I want to pay them a decent wage so they can afford to save and go to university or save to buy a house, right? So the local communities, emotional connections with people, that increases your moral fortitude, say, or at least plugs into your moral fortitude in the way that brings out the best in you. Plus, it's like you've got 5 employees, you pay them each $1 less an hour, and you get $5 more an hour. Whereas if you've got 50,000 employees, you pay them all $1 an hour less. That's $50,000 an hour now in your pocket. So it's not quite the same thing when it comes to a religious organization, but it's similar in the sense of
It's similar. It's actually similar, and what you just said is extremely profound because it's affecting you in 2 ways. If the people I'm dealing with are more removed from me emotionally, then I'm going to have a more difficult time, no matter how morally advanced I am and how morally aware I am. I'm just going to have a more difficult time caring about their happiness and distress. I don't know them. I don't have any connection with them. It's going to be a stretch for me, even if I'm a genuinely, deeply moral and ethical person. The other problem is that if I exploit 50,000 people, I profit much more than if I exploit 5 people. So if I'm managing 5 people who I know, I'm going to be more inclined to take care of them because I know them. I'm going to have to be very, very, very morally bankrupt in order to be exploitive towards people that I know well. Whereas I only have to be slightly morally bankrupt to exploit people that I don't know at all. And also my temptation is greater. My temptation to exploit 5 people is not as great as my temptation to exploit 50,000. So if I'm managing something that's huge and I'm further removed, it's big and I'm further removed, I have a more moral temptation to exploit and less moral connection to not exploit. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's precisely.
Yes. And so therefore, which tends to happen in a bureaucracy, where there's centralization, a centralized bureaucracy. It tends to be bigger and there's a bigger distance of emotion. And I see also in a religious organization that leaders can tend to be in what I call a kind of bubble, where they're really not connected with the lived experiences of the people that they're managing. Often they've never experienced them themselves. So if you have people who, they were never married, they never had children, they never had a job, they never had a business, they never lived in a place outside of a temple ashram, they've only lived in a temple ashram as a renunciate, and they just really, all they have to do with families is maybe they go to someone's house to give a class. Their ability to understand the needs and the thinking and the situation of the people that they're ministering to is small. They can't relate to it. It doesn't have anything in their experience. And if they're a leader of many, 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 many people, then again, the temptation to exploit is going to be higher because the benefit of exploiting is greater. So the emotional detachment is greater, and the moral bankruptcy situation is greater. So yeah, it's a recipe for catastrophe if you're dealing with somebody who's human. And I think most of us are human. You know, we're expecting that people are not going to be human. You know, I don't know what we're expecting of them. We're expecting they're all going to be God or something, and they're not. They're human. So when you put a human in that situation, it's understandable that they may do poorly. They may not even realize they're doing poorly. It may not be a conscious evil thing that's going on.
Yeah, I really think we can explain a lot of the things wrong with the world based on poor incentive structures and people being too distant from the consequences of the decisions. But I'm a big believer in human nature, that you put people in the right environment, that they'll do amazing things.
Yes, what you've said is also very true. It's not true for everybody. Obviously, there are people who engage in horrific criminal activities with their own family members. So, you know, this is definitely not true for everybody.
Right, but by and large.
By and large.
There's a nice quote from a French economist who's anti-communism, Frédéric Bastiat. If the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to permit people to be free, how is it that the tendencies of these organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their appointed agents also belong to the human race, or do they believe that they themselves are made of a finer clay than the rest of mankind?
Yes. I mean, I'm thinking about my smartphone. You know, I know that there are enslaved children in Africa mining rare metals in order for me to have a rechargeable lithium battery in my phone. I know that, but I don't know any of those children. And my sense of responsibility is very small.
Yeah. They do it.
I mean, it's a problem.
There's some interesting social science studies on, like, you know, people's moral decision-making power. I can't remember what it was about people. It's definitely like they find interesting things with money, like if, oh yeah, well, this is what I'm thinking of. If they give people math problems and say, if you complete it in a certain amount of time, you'll get a prize. And then they know how long it takes to complete the math problem, so they know if people are lying or not on average. And then they change things like, we'll give you $1 each, or we'll give you a token, and then you go over there and then you get $1. And if they give them the token, they're more likely to cheat. But if they give them the $1, they're less likely to cheat, because the token's like, it's not real. It's just a bit of paper. And then I go over there and I trade it for the $1. But the $1 is the thing you're getting directly. Then it's like, wow, now I'm stealing, I'm cheating. You know, it's like, so I guess that's
fascinating. There's a book I read some time ago called Predictably Irrational, which is about a common human behavior that doesn't make sense, but is done by human beings. But anyway, we have to keep these sort of things in mind when we're setting up an organization, and to have an organization that is organic rather than bureaucratic, and that is decentralized rather than centralized, is exactly what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Srila Prabhupada wanted, where the people who are taking the responsibility are the people who have the authority, and the people who are having the authority are the people who are taking the responsibility. That is where, if I mess up, I have the consequences of that mess up. And if I have the consequences, I have the ability to make the decisions.
Yeah,
it goes both ways.
I think that's why grassroots works better, because, like, I say I start a little program and I put my own money into buying a projector and a microphone and working out a whole hire and paying the deposit. then I'm really going to want that program to work. Whereas if it's like the temple just provides all the funds, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, then like I might not even turn up one week because it's like, oh, it's just too inconvenient. I hadn't mowed the lawn for 3 weeks. I needed to mow the lawn. Sorry.
You're also, you're also putting your finger on something that Srila Prabhupada specifically said about centralization. He talked about it in terms of money. He said not that we should centralize money and everybody goes to some central place to beg that money. I'm thinking about this little flower garden that I've created and taken care of right next to Tulsi's greenhouse here at the temple. So I've either paid for everything there or arranged everything there. Most of it I both paid for and arranged. And I have a very strong motive to take care of it. And I'm about to travel and someone else is going to take care of it. And I was out there today and I have 5 solar powered lights there that look really beautiful in the garden at night. And I was noticing that with one of them, the light was moved so that the solar panel was in the shade. And so I moved it so the solar panel was catching the sun. And I thought, when I'm gone and someone else is taking care of the garden, will they even notice that? I'm the one who did the shopping and picked out this solar light. I spent an hour looking at different solar lights and picking this one out. I'm the one who spent the money on the light. I'm the one who then bought a better battery than what came in the light and installed that better battery. I'm the one who bought the little screwdriver so I could unscrew the light and put in the better battery. Then I'm the one who found the spot in the garden which would catch the most sun and look the most beautiful at night. And I'm the one who put that in, and I'm the one who lives here. And so every night I walk past it and see the lights on and think how beautiful it is. And I thought, so I have this strong personal investment in wanting to take care of it. Whereas someone else coming in, the light catcher thing might be in the shade for a month and they wouldn't notice.
Right.
So
I don't even know how you convey that onto someone else. Like I have an apprentice I've had for a year now, and he's a really good employee. But there's just certain things I know because like I order the materials, I handle the materials, I put them in the van, I make sure they're in stock, and then like I sent him to my house to grab some light fittings, and he sees them in the white box because they come in a box of 10, but the white box of 10 comes in a box of 3, which is a different color. He was looking all around and he was looking for the white box, and he's like, looks, he saw the gray box, brown box, and thought, oh, that won't be it because it's white, they're in white boxes, and then walked right past it. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. I can see how I would probably do the same thing in that situation, but how would I even have prevented that from happening? Like, I've just got the curse of knowledge, right? So I don't think to say, look for a brown box. And it's just like little things like that come up all the time. And it's like, how do you really
but it's also, I think it's also just a sense of having the main responsibility.
Yeah. But then you get too stressed out if you got all the responsibility.
I manage the public bathrooms here at the temple. So I make sure that there's toilet paper, I make sure that there's soap, I make sure that, there's everything's clean and all that. And I was out of town for Janmashtami last year, and I come back and all the soap dispensers are empty. I came back like 4 days after Janmashtami. All the soap dispensers were empty. And I said, this must have happened in the middle of the Janmashtami festival.
All right.
How could you? I was so upset. I said, how could you have the Janmashtami festival and let all 4 dispensers be out of stock?
Right.
Oh, I just didn't even think about it. And I said, I wrote it down. I even wrote a checklist.
Right.
And still that's what happened. So yeah, local management. And the people who have the authority have the responsibility, and the people who have the responsibility have the authority. And it tends to be separate. In a bureaucracy, people have authority without consequence, without responsibility, and people have responsibility and consequence without authority. And, it's obviously the most frustrating for the people who have the responsibility without the authority. But the people who have the authority without the responsibility also frustrate a lot of people, because they make decisions without understanding the impact of those decisions and without themselves experiencing any direct consequence for the impact. And they then can easily just blame everybody else. Well, people aren't coming, people aren't doing service, people aren't participating because they're not sincere, or they're this or they're that. No, it's your poor decision that you're so out of touch with how people are going to, feel this. And I can't count how many times I've gone to leadership and I've said, do you realize that because you've made this particular decision, therefore there's this particular consequence that's happening? Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, I just saw that recently in a letter that the GBC circulated. And I brought up to the leadership, I said, this particular paragraph in this letter, if this is put into effect, the results are going to be terrible. They're going to be catastrophic. This is what this, it says A, it's going to lead to B, and you don't want B. That's what it's going to lead to. And nobody paid the slightest bit of attention. Why? Because they're not going to suffer those ill effects.
I think another thing is the leaders are thinking, well, if I give the responsibility to these people, they'll make mistakes, and I don't want them to make mistakes.
Oh, there you go. You've hit the nail on the head. It's what? Pride, isn't it?
Well, it's also true that people will make mistakes.
Well, but you don't make mistakes.
Well, that goes back to my quote from Frederick Bastiat about, where are we going to find these saints from to manage that are never going to make mistakes?
This is the whole guru authorization absurdity, concoction, is based exactly on what you just talked about. Well, we're not going to let people choose their own gurus because they choose wrongly. So you always choose rightly?
Yeah. But
all the gurus you've chosen, all the gurus you've chosen in your authorization process were all saints? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And like someone on the GBC said to me, the less we know about a guru candidate, the more likely we are to approve them.
Is that how they think about it, or is that just a retrospective analysis they worked out?
A retrospective analysis.
That's funny.
If I don't know, if it's just so-and-so Swami in such and such remote place, and I've never heard of the person, they've never done anything noteworthy internationally, I don't know anything about them, and the local group recommends them, then I'm just going to say, sure. I just saw that with sannyas candidates. That sannyas candidates were put forward, and GBC persons were saying, well, I don't know any of these people, so if they're put forward, I'm just going to approve them.
Right.
Whereas if you have somebody who's actually a notable international preacher, they've produced a lot of books, they travel a lot, they're very well known, and then they come up for approval, then it's likely that somebody on the GBC will know them and say, oh, I don't like the way they blow their nose. So and then we're saying, well, these people have a better position for approving rather than the disciple on who will bear the consequences primarily if the guru's bogus.
Same
right?
principle.
I mean, it's the same thing, that it's the disciple primarily who will suffer. The ISKCON leadership suffers slightly, especially if the person does something horrific, but it's primarily the disciple who's going to suffer or benefit. And the disciple is supposed to be right there testing the guru. And you're going to say, well, the disciples are too uneducated to know. Well, then educate them.
Yeah.
Educate them. And whereas the leadership, they're voting on people that they don't know. And they're more likely to approve someone if they don't know them.
But yeah, the educating people one is...
If you want to be a guru in ISKCON, then, don't do anything noteworthy. Make sure nobody knows your name, and then go through the process, and then you're likely to get approved.
I think it's the same principles for education styles. Say you want to send your children to a particular school. The parents should have some choice. So here's everything you can learn about these different education styles or these different schools. Here's what all the experts say, and you choose what you think is best for your kids. And I think the parent who cares the most about the child is going to make the best decision for their child because they have that care. And maybe it's not the case in every situation that every parent's going to make the best child than some expert, but overall the net benefit to children is going to be greater if you place that decision-making power in the hands of people who care the most. Well,
and this is something on which I would disagree, because I also think that we should value expertise. So one of the other things that I see in the modern world is everybody thinks they're an expert on everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite frustrating for any of us who have, and most of us have expertise in something, right? Most people have expertise in something. So it's very frustrating in your own area of expertise to have people who don't know anything argue with you just because they care.
I'm glad I
So
brought up this analogy with you because
I
you can
don't
push
think that
back on it
just
well.
because the parents, I don't think it's just because the parents hopefully care the most if they're good parents, and are the most going to deal with the consequences, that they necessarily know more than experts. But I think the experts should also be people who are involved.
But let's say
I
we
mean,
have
one of my frustrations as a teacher was dealing with parents who were sure they knew what they were talking about when they didn't at all.
yeah.
And it was, it was extremely frustrating that just because you're the parent of this child doesn't mean you have the slightest idea of what works educationally.
I think this is
And insisting that I do this or that as a teacher when it's like, that would actually be a very bad thing.
I think this is a good analogy because it's basically got all the dynamics at play that carry over to so many other areas. Because, I mean, you probably heard some two stories of the mainstream education system really letting a child down, and then the parent goes and does some research and figure out what the child needs and addresses the child's needs. So, in cases where the experts are failing, or so-called experts are failing, we need some checks and balances for that, where the parent can step in and find.
Absolutely.
But then the parent that's doing that, they're not just reinventing the wheel themselves or getting some inspiration from God and figuring out what the child needs. They find a book written by another expert, or a school run by people who know what they're doing that meets the child's needs. And so they're still leveraging off of experts. They're just choosing their experts carefully.
I mean, I'm just thinking about a student I had who did wonderfully in math, except when it came time to take a test. And whenever she had to take a math test, then she was failing. And so the parents, who were Asian, not Indian, but Asian, especially the mother, was telling me that I had to put more pressure on this child to do well on the tests. And after some weeks of doing special tutoring and special work with this child, I found out that the reason she was failing her test was that she was under so much pressure from her family to get high grades on her test that she was freezing. She was panicking and freezing. And so the parent's solution was to put more pressure on her, which was exactly the opposite of what she needed. What she needed was a way to feel relaxed and confident when she took a test. So as soon as we did that, she started getting A pluses on all of her tests. It was quite interesting. And because I have a lot of training, not only in teaching and in pedagogy, but also in counseling, I was able to discover this, whereas her parents couldn't because they didn't have the tools. So, just because you don't have a bureaucracy doesn't mean we don't have expertise.
Yeah, totally.
In fact, part of an organic system, part of a living system, is the concept of expertise, and the concept that in an organic system, the brain has a different function than the stomach, which has a different function than the liver, which has a different function than the lungs. And the different parts of the body rely on the cells that are experts in their field. So I think, in a bureaucratic system, you're going to have people making decisions just because they have a title rather than because they have expertise.
That's a good point. Yeah.
The people who should be making the decisions are definitely the people who are going to have the consequences of those decisions, but also people who are actually expert. I mean, the example I was given of having leaders who have only been renunciates, who've never been in family situations. So that gives them two problems, at least. One is that they're divorced from the consequences of their decisions. Right? They're going to make decisions about families, but it's not going to affect them because they don't have any. But another problem is that they don't have the expertise. They don't have the lived experience as a basis for making good decisions. Now, the people who have the expertise are not always exactly the same people who are going to bear the consequences. So saying that the people who are going to bear the consequences should make the decisions is not an absolute. it's also incumbent upon people to work with those who have expertise. Just like I'm going to bear the results of poor electrical wiring, but that doesn't mean that I decide how to wire my house. I do need to pull in a licensed electrician. Now, I should have a lot of say about which licensed electrician.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make.
Like that. But I also need to remember that, hey, I'm not a licensed electrician. Now, that's very different than someone else who doesn't live in my house and isn't going to deal with faulty wiring, ordering me who to hire and what kind of electricity to be put in.
Yeah, the schools debate goes on in America because I think there's not so much school choice in parts of America, at least, where it's like you just have to send your kid to the local school. And
you've got a lot of school choice if you've got money.
Right. And then there's these charter schools now, and I was listening to some podcasts on them. Some of them, it sounds like they're quite well run. But coming back to this point of, so obviously we need expertise. I think the education analogy is perfect because, like you gave that one example of parents doing their child harm. Well, they definitely care, but they just don't know how to apply that care in a way that gets the results that they're after.
They cared, and they were much more going to bear the brunt of the decision than the teacher was.
Yeah.
So if the child failed at math, the consequence of that would affect the parents a lot more than would affect the teacher. So they probably cared more than the teacher, and they had more of the consequence, but they didn't have the expertise. And so although they meant well, they had good intentions, they didn't have ill intentions. They loved their child. They were trying to do what was right for the child, but they were actually causing the problem.
Well, just drawing quickly on that, the example again. You as the expert in that situation, giving the advice, you still have consequences because your incentive structure is in the right place. You're motivated by the right thing. So if you were an educator because you thought that was how you were going to align your bank account with billions of dollars, then you might not care so much about what the child's doing, but that's not how you line your bank account. That's just that's just what you're passionate about. And it's just so happens that it's arranged that you can survive while doing that. But you pay consequences because you care about that child and because of your reputation. If it's found that you repeatedly give advice to parents or repeatedly the children who you educate have bad results, then you could lose your job. People could pull the kids out of the school that you're running.
Yes, definitely as the teacher, there's also caring and there's also consequence, but not as much.
Like the parent could have a bad experience.
The caring isn't as much and the consequence is not as much. But yes, they're as for the parents. But definitely you care, and if you don't care about the kids, you shouldn't be in the classroom. And yes, there are also consequences. So that's different from, say, a decision being made by a school board, where they don't know the children personally. I mean, we've seen this kind of thing. This kind of thing goes on, in the big school systems, where there's decisions being made. I can't remember the exact thing anymore, but it was when I was working in a government school. And there was some decision made about the first graders, the 6-year-olds. I can't remember the exact thing. And all of the first grade teachers were furious. They were just completely furious. And they were saying, the people who are making these decisions, they haven't been in the classroom for 20 years and they've lost touch with what our actual situation is.
That brings up a good point because like a lot of bad decisions are made when you congregate the consequences, the negative side of the consequences, while removing the upside. So like a doctor with a patient, say somebody's got cancer, it's like, here's a risky medication, but I think it'll work in your case. Let's take a risk. Whereas it's like, a board making a decision for what hundreds of doctors can do. Yeah, if we allow doctors to do this, there's bound to be at least one person who suffers from it. Even if 5 people are benefited, or even if 100 people are benefited, at least one person's going to suffer from it. And that one person, that's going to turn into a legal case, which will come hammering down on us. So let's just ban it. Whereas,
Yes.
the local doctor is not going to be
Exactly.
thinking that way. They're just going to be thinking, yeah, I'm going to take a risk here, but I care about this patient, and this is what I think is the best thing in this particular case, even though it's risky.
Yeah, I mean, basically what we're coming up with is all of, so many reasons and so many examples why things work better when they're organic and decentralized.
Yeah. Okay.
There just aren't, if you look at Vedic ideas of government, we read about how there were world emperors. Yudhisthira was a world emperor, and we may have a certain thing in our head about what that means. But if we read the scripture carefully, we see that in the United States, for example, we have 50 states, and each state has their own government. Then in each state, there are counties, and each county has its own government. And then in each county, there are cities that have their own government. Now, we don't call the heads of each of these kings. We have mayors, and then we have county councils, and then we have governors, and then we have a president. But in Vedic times, each of these little areas were kingdoms. Like Kamsa was the king of Mathura, which was basically a metropolitan area. It would be equivalent to today in America, a mayor. So that was a kingdom. And you have like the kingdom of Mathura included Vrindavan. It was the metropolitan area. So it was the city of Mathura, and it included Vrindavan. And then Nanda Maharaj in Vrindavan had to pay taxes, but he only paid taxes to Kamsa. He was not paying taxes to Duryodhana or Pandu. He was only paying taxes to Kamsa. So in that system, you had, and then Nanda was in charge of Vrindavan. Nanda is called the king of Vrindavan, although he was a Vaishya, not a Kshatriya. So Nanda's in charge of Vrindavan. He's getting taxes. He's paying them to Kamsa. Then Kamsa is going to pay taxes to the next level of government only. I mean, in America, you usually pay federal, state, and local taxes. So the federal government is getting tax money from all the 350 basically, million citizens, probably not from everybody, not from children, etc., directly. Whereas in Vedic times, you only paid your taxes to the local government. The local government then took part of those taxes and paid to the next level. They took part of their taxes and then paid to the next level. So we find that when Yudhisthira becomes the emperor, the kings, the next level of kings, were paying him taxes. The people in general were not paying him taxes directly. That's a very decentralized system. Even though you had a central leader for, perhaps it was the whole world. I don't know if it was actually the entire planet, but let's just say it was the entire planet. It was still a highly, highly decentralized system.
Yeah, my understanding is even the local
responsibility. You got your taxes from your local area, and you had to take care of people in your local area. You were not directly pulling taxes from somebody a million miles away.
My understanding is that even the local kings, they weren't making all kinds of laws about, like making it illegal for you to smoke marijuana and all sorts of things like that. They were just protecting you from criminals, and they would also store up wealth. So in times of need, they would spend that wealth, making sure the citizens didn't starve. And other than that, it was very, other than preventing.
I don't know. I mean, the idea was that the local leaders and the bigger leaders were making laws on the advice of the Brahmanas according to the directions of the scriptures.
Yeah. Well, even then, if there were laws, prohibiting certain kinds of behavior, they'd be local rather than like coming from the central king of the whole world.
Yes, exactly. And these laws were going to be tailored to the local culture and the local customs.
We should probably wrap it up soon.
I'm probably going to need to, we've been on for 90 minutes. Yeah. And I think I'm going to need to start winding up. If there's something else that we'd like to discuss.
Yeah. There's one last point.
Maybe like another 5 minutes max, sure. And then I think I have to wind up.
So just relating to that topic, there's this idea of using laws and force versus using culture and morality, what moral expectations and so on. So um, a lot of modern civilization in the West, people have explained that the way America with so much freedom has succeeded is because it's a Christian country. So there's certain moral standards of not cheating and so on that come from Christian culture that has enabled there to be so much freedom. And whether or not that's true, I think we could leave aside and just talk about the principle of you can have cultural expectations, cultural norms, and these can bring a finer degree of good behavior and create a better society than you can get just with force and laws alone. So, and I imagine this relates to organizational culture.
It does, and it relates to policy implementation. Generally speaking, if you try to implement any kind of policy or any kind of law, and you only use punishment, or if you use even punishment and reward, your chances for unintended consequences, unintended opposite consequences, are extremely high. I'll give you a simple example. There was a law passed in the United States that medical doctors had to provide facility for people who were disabled. That's nice, right? We want people who are disabled to be able to get as good of medical care as people who are not disabled, right? It's a good idea. So let's say someone is deaf. They need a sign language interpreter, and the doctor has to provide a sign language interpreter. Great idea, right? And there's punishments for not providing a sign language interpreter. But guess what? There was not. There was not funding. Now, a sign language interpreter can cost $120 an hour. So how many doctors are going to pay $120 an hour to get a sign language interpreter for a deaf patient? Now, it's pretty easy for the reservationists, right? The person making the appointments, the secretaries, and the doctors to know whether or not someone is deaf. It's not a difficult thing for them to know. Now, what happened after this law was put into effect is that doctors basically stopped seeing deaf patients.
Right.
So deaf patients went from getting poor care. Think about this. People who were deaf went from getting poor care where they didn't have an interpreter, they had to communicate without an interpreter, to getting no care.
Right. Yeah, there's hundreds of
Why?
examples like that.
Because it was a law, simply, it was just a dictate.
Yeah, there was a similar case
in
like that with
Canada-
disabled people in employment. So it used to be that I think it was the 90s in America that came up with a law saying if you have disabled employees, here's a bunch of rights they have. And as an employer, it's like, well, I don't really want to hire disabled people anymore. Whereas before that, it's like, yeah, maybe this person won't be the best candidate, but I'll give them a go. I would like to help this person. They're disabled. They're struggling to get a job. I'll take a risk and we'll see if it works, and I'll make some accommodations. And it was like a kind of goodwill thing, and it was happening. And then when they made it a law, that's like, here's all the things and all the things, and then it just became too expensive to have disabled employees, so they stopped being able to get jobs.
Exactly. So such is often the case when things are put into practice just by force. Now, having force and punishment is not absolutely wrong. We do want to put thieves and rapists and arsonists and murderers in jail by force. It's not that force is entirely wrong. And Krishna says, of all means of suppressing lawlessness, I am punishment. So it's not that we are abjuring punishment entirely. However, when rules are made simply on the basis of punishment, if that's the only means by which we convince people to do something, we are likely to get unintended consequences that are exactly the opposite of what we intend. I mean, if you want to look at some of the most clever ways of instituting laws, One of them is the use of seatbelts in cars. So when I was a child, there weren't any seatbelts in cars, or people didn't bother to use them. So when the laws came out about using seatbelts, one of the ways that the government did the implementation of this law was they went to the media producers, they went to the movie and television producers and said, show people putting on seatbelts when they get into cars. They established it, like you were saying, as a cultural norm. Now, there's other things that they did. The government forced the car manufacturers to install beepers. So if you try to drive away without your seatbelt buckled, it beeps at you. That's not exactly a punishment. That's what we call negative reinforcement. So you have, the punishment that you're going to get a ticket, the negative reinforcement of the beeping, and then you create a norm within society that people wear seatbelts. I mean, a similar, if we talk about, again, with driving, say drunk driving. So, when I was a kid, I never heard about drunk drivers and don't drink and drive. And that wasn't the thing when I was growing up. And I'm sure that people were regularly driving drunk. But that was the movement against drunk driving and driving while impaired was started by a woman whose child was killed by a drunk driver. And she gradually got up enough impetus within the society that there became strict laws and punishment for driving drunk. But there also became, again, a cultural norm of don't drink and drive. And it's interesting in that respect. Again, we have the use of the media, that the concept that when people go in a group out of their homes to drink, like at a pub or something, that one person doesn't drink and that person is a designated driver. So that concept was brought to society again through the media, that the person who came up with this idea went to the TV and movie producers and said, would you give me 1 minute in your show, in your film, that would save thousands of lives? And they're like, sure. Said, okay, whenever you have a group drinking in a public place, have them use the words designated driver. Have them say, who's the designated driver? And it became part of the culture.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, movies are powerful. There's another example of the converse, where racism in America was fueled by the way black people were portrayed in theater and movies, where they'd always have the black guy as some creepy evil character. And that's got me. And racism is an interesting one because it's quite a subtle thing. I'm like, sure, you can make racism illegal. By and large, people agree that racism is a bad thing, but like, you can't really make racism illegal in the sense that if people just don't like people from another race, they're going to continue to not like them, and that's going to impact those people's lives. So it really has to be a cultural transformation. So like they found that like one way you reduce xenophobia is you get people from different cultures to sit down together and have meals. Like they get to know one another.
Well, also it's particularly useful if that's done in childhood. So like my parents sent me to a school that did intentional integration. We had kids there from all different nationalities and races, which was very unusual in a school, in those days, in the 1950s. But in order to have norms in society, you really have to have a broad, it's not that there's no punishment. It's like I say, we want to put the rapists in jail. We want to put the murderers in jail. It's not that we don't have any punishment. We want to arrest the drunk drivers. But if all you have is punishment, if that's your only way, then you're likely to produce opposite unintended consequences. So if you're really going to change behavior in a society and you're really going to regulate behavior in a society, it needs to be done on a broad spectrum. And the main way you change people's behavior is you find out what's driving the bad behavior and you find a better way to meet those needs. This is what Krishna talks about, param dristvani vartate. You get a higher taste. What's the motive that's driving that behavior? Why are people doing that bad behavior? What are they trying to get out of it? What pleasure are they getting out of it? What benefit are they getting out of it? And find a way for them to get that benefit in another way. Basically remove the causes of the bad behavior. And such is the most effective way to change a society and to change difficult things in a society. There's nothing more effective than that. I mean, one thing we can look at in that regard is that there's prodigious statistical evidence that children raised by their biological parents or loving adoptive parents in an intact, loving family, raised by, a father and a mother in a loving family, are far, far, far more likely to do well in school, to have good physical health, to have good mental health, to become productive moral citizens of society. There's so much evidence for this, it's unbelievable. The greatest predictor of whether somebody's going to be a moral, ethical person, a law-abiding citizen, and make a contribution to society and be physically, mentally, emotionally, socially healthy, is whether or not they're raised in an intact, loving family. We know that. This is not some kind of a secret. Now, obviously, some kids raised in that sort of family will still be criminals, and obviously there are good, wonderful people raised in horrible, messy situations. But on the whole, if we want to have a sane, stable society, we should first look at the bedrock of society, which is the family. This is the whole concept of ashram dharma. And doing that is much, much, much more effective. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Doing that is much, much, much more effective than, heavy punishments for crime and incarcerating people and all that kind of stuff. So, you look at what are the ultimate causes of the bad behavior? Where is it coming from? What's driving it?
The sad thing about
this is, again, true across the board.
The sad thing about that particular dynamic is that government policies that tackle problems at that level take 15 years till you see a reduction in crime, because people are about 15 years when they start committing crimes if they're going to be criminals at the earliest. Right. So if you're going to take that kind of strategy of making sure people are raised well as your crime strategy, but you got to get re-elected in 3 or 4 years, it's not really going to succeed for your election campaign, because the public's often not smart enough to understand what it is you're doing until they see the results.
And there we're back right to the beginning of form follows function.
Yeah, that also ties back into the point with the discussion we're having about experts, because like one of the points I was going to make about the school is you could have different schools with different experts. They can make their own decisions. It's not that the bureaucracy is coming down and choosing. And when you do that, there are going to be different ways that different teachers teach and different schools are managed. But you can see the kids in those programs and see how they're doing and think, take my kid here, for a day, see what the other kids are like. I want my kid to be like these kids. I'm going to take my kid to this school.
Mm. But yeah, with government, the form of democracy where the government changes frequently, it was designed to limit the power of government. That whole form was created to intentionally create very weak government. That was its purpose. I mean, most democracies do allow the democratic leaders to stay in power for an extended period of time. Even like the United States Constitution, originally you could re-elect a president unlimitedly. They just had to be re-elected every 4 years, but you could keep doing that unlimitedly. It was only after Franklin Delano Roosevelt that they limited it to 2 terms. But the whole idea was that the monarchs were abusing power. So therefore, let's cripple government. I mean, the whole concept of democracy is to cripple government, to make government as weak as possible, but still be able to function.
We could probably
give government just enough strength to function. But one of the downsides is what you're talking about, that then the people in government don't have the incentive to do something that has a 15 or 20 year out consequence. Because right back to what we were talking about before, that they're not going to experience the consequences of those decisions. So that their incentive is less, their incentive is much higher to do short-term things, which may not actually solve the problem, may exacerbate it in the long term for the citizens. All right, I do think we need to wrap up.
Yeah, we could carry on for a long time, but yeah, let's wrap it up.
I was just thinking we could be talking about this. I mean, now it's 6:30 at night here. We could be talking about this till 10:30 at night.
Yeah.
But I really do have some other things I need to attend to.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks for that. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.